For me, when I'm supervising a PhD student, I like to think of that student as a sort of budding colleague or a junior colleague. So although it is a relationship of supervision and help and assistance and editing and marking and all these things that we're used to doing as a teacher, I think I often try to start thinking about that student as someone who in 3 years' time or 3.5 years' time or whatever will be a colleague, whether that's in the academy or outside of the academy. And so of course that relationship is a little bit different than you might have with someone who you're just going to sort of teach for a year and then that person's going to move on. And so I think from the start you think about that as a more lasting relationship and really a relationship of mentoring. So I guess in practice it's about, particularly at the beginning of a project, sort of finding the ways in which you both work well together and really trying to assess what an individual student's needs are in terms of their research training or their writing or their confidence. I think so much about working on a PhD is actually about building self-confidence, and that's something that supervisors can help a lot with.
It's important for students to have a community, and that doesn't necessarily just mean their supervisor. So I try and put my students in a shared office with other students doing similar work. This means that they've got easy access to low-level support. A simple question about where do I go to get stationery? It doesn't need your supervisor, but it can leave a student stumped for hours or days, whereas someone on the next desk can say, yes, this is what you do. Knowing about basically how to solve problems, who to talk to, and so a community gives them that. I think they also develop friendships, and it makes happier students if they're in a shared offices. I've been in situations where I've shared students in individual offices or in offices with other students who are writing up that are often absent, and students that are in populated offices and heavily populated offices. The students in populated offices almost always are happier. I think one discipline I've tried to maintain is to do casual drop-ins to my students. Now I think I've talked to colleagues about this, and some of them disagree with me and feel that it's watching over your student's shoulder. But I think bumping into your students on a daily basis, be it at coffee, be it dropping in to see another student in their office and talking to them, gives them a forum to ask simple questions. Ones that they would not necessarily bother you with because they don't want a formal meeting. And just chatting, it's amazing how much you can help a student when they say, oh, could you just answer this quick question, please? It takes 2 minutes of your time, and I think they really value it. I think it also shows that you're interested in what they do.
All of the students that I've supervised, I've generally had some sort of extended period of quite close time with them. Either a field trip where I've taken them on the field trip and basically almost lived with them for a week or so, or gone to a meeting with collaborators where we've been spending 24 hours a day with each other for several days, or they're people who've worked with me in the field for a long time and are coming to Glasgow as students. So initially having some time period where we can get to know each other on a personal level, as well as getting a feel for how they're excited about different aspects and what they might find frustrating. Another thing that I've done quite often with students is actually now starting to work in shared directories together. So we have documents that they're essentially working on that I can give them feedback on, and that we can go back and forth it's really in a collaborative way, but it allows me to help keep track of the changes that they're making and not end up with a long list of documents that are difficult to track. And I think it helps to develop a better workflow. So eventually, I hope my students will publish their research, and they actually need to publish the data, they need to publish the code if it's some kind of analysis, and having a shared folder where we work back and forth on these things together, I think helps them to develop improved habits and allows them to make their science really reproducible, so that you can see exactly what stages they've gone through, and their final thesis also includes the workings, the analysis, the data, and so on.
I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is communication, and having very clear communications with students they understand what the requirements of doing a PhD are, that you understand the world they're living in, because people come with so many different sets of backgrounds when they're doing a PhD.
I think that students by and large like an element of structure. So I try and set up a really quite coordinated timetable of meetings associated with various kinds of targets, which could be writing targets, or by that point in time you'll have actually done a certain amount of work in the archive, or you'll have done a certain amount of work in the field. You may be producing a progress report for me. But actually building up a series of completed tasks, and particularly good if they're written tasks, because that's work that's being written down, ready to be translated in various ways into the final thesis. But I think that a programme that's then organised, fairly disciplined, is actually crucial. Some students maybe want that more than others. Some students maybe, to be honest, need that more than others. But it should be negotiated and in the context of what is hopefully a well worked out, developing human relationship between supervisor and student, supervisors and student.
I currently have 5 PhD students. They're all working on translation studies. However, every student is completely different. So my approach to supervision changes with the student that I'm working with. One thing that doesn't change is I really value a lot of feedback. Sometimes I might provide a lot of notes on a piece of work, but generally the students say, well, that's so helpful, we'd rather have lots of feedback than none at all and then have to worry at a later date. So I also always plan meetings at the end of each meeting, so there's always something 2 weeks ahead that's in their diary, which is helpful. And I also have PhD students who are in the same building as me, and I have an open door policy, which means that if they just have a little query or something, they can knock on my door.
Our role, as I see it, is to offer encouragement, enthusiasm, and to try and instill some kind of self-belief. So I think there's a certain amount of just trying to encourage people through it. Those moments when they feel that they're not really where they thought they should be by that stage, and so on, or they're starting to have certain doubts about the initial premises and so on and so forth. And I think another fundamental, it goes without saying, it's just to have regular contact and constant engagement. It's important to keep on top of the monthly meetings and to be on hand in between times, because I think we all find as supervisors that yes, we have our meetings, we have the end of year reviews, but the contact in practice is often far more regular than that, and especially when you get to the latter stages of the writing up and so on.
One of the things I like to try to do is involve students as much as possible in my own area of work, and that's easier for some students than it is for others. So coming from social sciences, what often happens is that the students approach you with an idea for a PhD topic. And so in some ways I've ended up supervising some students where they're on the periphery of my own research area. And so in those circumstances it's quite hard to involve them directly in some of my work. But I try to do that as much as I can. But where I've gone down the line of a more science model, so where I've managed to bring money in and I've advertised for a PhD student, that means that that student is much more directly related to my own research, and that's really rewarding to be able to really engage students like that in the research you're doing, the conferences that you're going to, that kind of thing. So I find that something I try as much as possible to include students in my own work. Another approach that I tend to try to take is to really balance positive feedback with constructive criticism that students need to receive. And I did get some really good feedback from one of my students at one point, where she was really upfront saying that she was finding the amount of track changes that she was getting in on her writing was too much for her at one point in time, and that it was a bit overwhelming. And it made me reflect a lot on how track changes tend to make you be slightly more critical than you might be in other settings. So there might be lots and lots of writing in there that's very, very good, but I haven't written necessarily after each of these paragraphs, this is fantastic, this is reading well. But what I have done is I've honed in on, I think you really need to look at this, check out, there's some references here that are missing, these kind of things. So that was actually very useful to have her feedback in order to be able to think about making sure I balance that positive and more constructively critical feedback.
My aim is to try to produce independent scientists at the end of the PhD. So it's not about having somebody who's going to be a pair of hands for you and do all your experiments for you. It's really about trying to develop their independence and their particular skills. You want somebody who's going to go out, think for themselves, use their initiative, go to someone else's lab and be able to start their own careers. And so my aim is really to facilitate that development. In terms of the sort of strategies, I think there are a number of things which are important. Firstly, I think it's essential that the student knows what is expected of them, what they have to do to be successful. And in fact, on day one, if you like, of the PhD, we go through a list of all of the things that would characterize a successful researcher. Critical appraisal of the literature, time management, multitasking, all of the various, there's a long, long list of things that we talk through. And then it's a case of returning to that list at various times and saying, well, you know, how are we getting on with whatever it happens to be? So I think that's one thing, so that they know what they have to do to be successful and what's expected of them. Ownership of the project is crucial. You can give them a project which you think is really wonderful and is important to you, but it might mean absolutely nothing to them. So they have to develop the ownership of their project. They do that by working out what are the important questions to ask. You can prompt them, but if they can work out themselves what are the important questions to ask, then they really want to know what the answers are. And that's what makes them motivated, makes them work to try to find out, you know, what they really want to do. And there are plenty of examples I can give where you tell a student, well, I think you should do this experiment, and they do it, but they're not really, you know, motivated to do it. Whereas if it's something that they really want to do themselves, then that's when they will really work hard and be productive. So getting ownership of the project is crucial.
I think in terms of values that inform my approach, it's about making the researcher or the student understand that they are not they're an equal partner in the relationship, that what they're finding out is as interesting and important to me as it is to them. It's about encouraging them to find their own way of learning, but at the same time keeping them directed, because one of the big challenges of a researcher is to go way beyond it. Everything is so interesting that it's so easy to become absorbed in issues that are not actually about the research questions. So I think my ethos is about respecting the student, and my strategy is to keep them on track, but to demonstrate that at the same time.